Good evening. I'd like to reconvene this special session of the Bloomington Common Council for Wednesday, the 23rd of October. This is a special session for the introduction of Ordinance 1924, which repeals and reenacts the text of Title 20, the Unified Development Ordinance. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Ruff.
Here.
Chopra.
Present and on time.
Piedmont Smith.
Oh, that wasn't a comment to you. Here.
Granger.
Present.
Rollo.
Here.
Bolin. I heard it. Sims.
Here.
Sturbaum. Here. Sandberg.
Thank you. Here's the agenda summation for this evening, and if you'd like an agenda, you may find it beside the clerk. We will visit council schedule. Then we'll proceed to Ordinance 1924 to repeal and replace Title 20 of the Bloomington Municipal Code entitled Unified Development Ordinance. Last evening, we didn't quite conclude our deliberations on Chapter 3. We had public comments until the end of our meeting. There was a motion to continue to back to council for questions and then to comment and deliberate. But that failed to have a second. So we may go back to that schedule before we go on to the introduction to proposed Unified Development Ordinance Chapters 4, which is the development standards and incentives, and Chapter 5, which is the subdivision regulations. And then we will proceed to any other matters or actions related to this proposal ready to be raised at this meeting before we recess again. So with that, do we have anything to address on council schedule, Mr. Sherman?
Correction. Last night I said we had a meeting Tuesday night, which is true. The time I said was wrong. Put on your calendar so you have it already, and I gather you have it. That meeting is at Nat U Hill Room. It starts at 6:30. Thank you.
Thank you, and let's all try to speak into our microphones. And I forget myself, but if we could all pull our microphones closer so we can be heard. So with that, we'll move on to the UDO. And is there what's the disposition of the council this evening? Shall we go on to Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, or shall we finish Chapter 3? Would someone like to make a motion to that effect?
I wanted to move that we pick up where we left off last night and give council members a chance for questions and final comments on Chapter 3.
Mm-hmm. Any questions or debate about that?
Second.
Okay, it has a second. All right. Do we need a roll call vote on this, Mr. Sherman? No. Okay. Yes. All right, let's have a roll call on the motion.
Councilmember Ruff. Yes. Chopra.
No.
Piedmont Smith.
Yes.
Granger. Rollo.
Yes.
Volin.
No.
Sims.
No.
Sturbaum.
Yes.
Sandberg.
No.
Oh.
So the motion fails. All right, then we will move on to the introduction to proposed Unified Development Ordinance Chapter 4. And Mr. Robinson, would you like to present? You have 20 minutes, I believe.
Good evening. My name is Scott Robinson. I'm the Assistant Director for the Planning and Transportation Department. Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to give a presentation this evening on Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Before I do that, I want to kind of premise this presentation that Chapter 4 has a lot of information in it. I'm going to give a very high-level overview so that it will allow some more time for some questions and answers. I feel like I just can't spend a lot of time going on that. But before I do, I want to follow up with some questions that we had last night. We did have some opportunity to research some of those questions. So there was a questions about the use of methadone or other treatment facility and opioid rehabilitation facilities. I'm going to turn that over to the City Attorney, Mike Rucker. He has a response for that question to help clarify that.
Michael Rooker, City Attorney. I think we're a little bit back in chapter 3 now, but I believe Councilmember Piedmont Smith had a question about why the uses related to methadone clinics and opioid rehabilitation clinics were conditional and in certain districts. The reason they're conditional is because we want to have a sense about where they're going. It's less than ideal to have all opioid rehabilitation facilities sort of in the same geographic space for a couple of reasons. We want them spread out so that we can avoid the potential negative consequences of having them in a concentrated area. We also want them spread out so that they're geographically accessible to different members of the community as well. So requiring a conditional use approval gives some authority to the city to make certain that they're spread out, that they're not all just concentrated in one space. Another reason is that, surprisingly, opioid rehab facilities are not heavily regulated by the state. And we don't have a local business licensing requirement, So we won't really know about these facilities without requiring a conditional use approval. And these clinics have been popping up in some communities, not necessarily Bloomington, but there have been some problems in other communities. And in fact, I think everybody is well aware that we've seen some actors in this community who did not 100% play by the rules. We've dealt with some enforcement actions in city legal with the Indiana Center for Recovery when they neglected to obtain a conditional use approval. That same center was also the subject of an enforcement action by the state for failing to comply with state fire code requirements. So we want to make sure we know about these things. And so that's why they're conditional as opposed to permitted uses. Does that sort of address your question?
The second question was the number of conditional uses our department reviews each year. On our department's website, there's a location where we have annual reviews where there's a number of permits, and this sort of information is provided, so it's readily available. What I did is I looked at the last, from 2016 through 2018, we had a total of 25 conditional use requests. Of those, 22 were approved. But I do want to highlight the difference between those numbers and what our staff reviews. We get a lot more people that come into our office for evaluation of what they can and can't do on their properties, what kind of standards they need to meet. And often with that consultation, staff provides direction, and many people often choose not to pursue a conditional use permit. They never apply for that. So I do want to clarify that while the number might seem low, many inquiries never end up leading anywhere. As far as the number of cases that the BZA hears, those 2 to 3 years, it was like 38 to 42 over those 2 years, the type of cases they hear. So I just wanted to clarify that. That information is available on the City Planning and Transportation website. The next question that was raised was the city services and which units they are limited to. I was correct, but sanitation is the only one that limits to residential units of 4 or less, but any commercial district sanitation does not serve. I'm not aware of any other city service that limits to residential units or districts. That's the only one that I'm aware of. Building area, there was a question about the building area. I just put up an example here. The building envelope in the R3 district, just using a minimum lot size of 50 by 100. That comes out to, if you did a 2-story building and used the setbacks, you end up with a building envelope of 1,800 square feet for a 2-story structure. The 2,250 square foot area is the impervious surface total. So it just gives you an idea of what that building envelope would be for a minimum lot in the R3. So that's the structure, that would be the area that you'd be allowed to build on that. Ownership requirements, there was some discussion about that. Again, at Plan Commission, we did talk about ownership requirements. There's a lot of difficulties associated with who the legal owner is, trusts and what have you, so just wanted to point that out for your attention. And then lastly, there was a question about number of city units and density. I just have a couple of graphics here to show you. The first one on the left is of the whole city's jurisdiction. The blue color is all land that's non-institutional, other than residential. The yellow is dedicated to single family. So on the little pie chart, you can see about 43% of the city's land area is dedicated to single family residential allowed uses. If you just look at land that's just available for residential uses, not the other land, then that percentage jumps up to 60%. And then there's some numbers on the far right looking at the total acreage of all land except for institutional and right-of-way. Those are acreage numbers, so 13,000. For everything except institutional, residential only, you have 9,400, single-family residential, 7,200 or 5,700 acres. If you break that out to units per acre, I gave some numbers there. Again, for all single-family residential, you're looking at about 8,900 units, comes out to about 3 units per acre. If you subtract out if you include vacant land and other uses, that drops down to about 2 units per acre. If you look at the R3 district, 2,100 single-family residential units, comes out to about 5.3 units per acre. Again, if you subtract out the vacant land and other uses on those lands, it comes down to 3 units per acre. And then the last is the American Community Survey estimate from 2017. There's 33,323 units in Bloomington, and there's from attached and detached single family, there's 14,856. So I just wanted to provide a little opportunity for some follow-up on those questions. And now I'll get into Chapter 4. This is the chapter dealing with development standards and incentives.
Mr. Robinson, could we just go to council in case there are any questions about the clarifications?
Well, my understanding with the presentation is I have 20 minutes to present.
We'll suspend that for a moment. So let's.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Do we want to grant Mr. Robinson an additional 20 minutes for the Chapter 4?
I think that would be appropriate.
I'll just reset the clock if you'll answer these questions.
My presentations, as I said, is going to be fairly high level and brief, so there will be plenty of time for questions. So I'd prefer just to forge ahead.
Okay.
All right, then we will go to questions after.
This is a question on what he just presented.
I have one too, but we can.
Okay, I mean, it's at the pleasure of the,
Let's dispose of these questions now, since
I'll
they're
pause
not
the
related to
clock.
Chapter 4. So, Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah, my only question was, did you include hearing officers for these conditional use
yes,
reviews? And there were only 25 in the years 2016 to 2018 altogether
that's correct.
for all conditional use?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I want to point out that that's of people that applied. We get many people that inquire about things, and again, staff provides direction on standards they need to meet, if it's consistent with other approvals, and gives them direction. Oftentimes, most people don't move forward with actually applying for a permit or a conditional use request.
Right, but 22 and 25 were approved. Right, thank you.
Your mic isn't on.
Councilmember Volin.
Mr. Robinson, I did think of one other city service that accrues to people in buildings with fewer than 5 units, and that would be parking permits in residential neighborhoods. They don't. Someone in a building larger than 4 units cannot get a residential parking permit. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I believe that's correct. I guess I was thinking more in the parking enforcement still enforces those areas, but that's,
Sure, but I
I
mean,
guess I'm
as
not
far as,
thinking of that as a service per se.
or a right that accrues to people who are in plexes or smaller.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the clarifications? I had one, Mr. Robinson. If we were discussing last night owner occupancy versus rentals in neighborhoods, and you said there was data available. Is it in the form of, is it broken down by neighborhood, or is it mapped?
We have a spreadsheet, and it was based on, I believe, the homestead exemption, and that's something that we can share.
Okay,
Yeah.
that would be helpful for me.
Okay.
All right, so we're restarting the clock. Well, actually, you don't need your whole time, but we will anyway. We'll restart the clock, and you can use as much as you like.
There are a little
Why
over
don't we
12 minutes left.
Proceed to Chapter 4.
Thank you. So, as you can see, I just listed the categories in Chapter 4. These are all the development standards that have to be considered when new developments or other activity happens on land throughout the community. Some of it's based on different zoning districts. I'm not going to talk about all of these. I just wanted to highlight that these are the categories within Chapter 4. The ones with asterisks, I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of highlighting in some of the changes. Some of the bigger things, as you've noticed, if you looked at the UDO, a lot of the changes have been reorganizing and trying to make it user-friendly. So again, that's kind of consistent with what you're seeing with the Chapter 4. Some of these standards have been separated to help clarify what's going on there. So the first part is applicability. This is a little table that's included in the UDO to help identify which development standards apply. There's kind of 3 different buckets that we're looking at: a change of use. So when a change of use happens on a site, you can see which development standards on this list would apply for the entire site versus disturbed areas. And then you have kind of new development and redevelopment situations where if it's new development, everything applies. If it's a redevelopment on a site, then there's a major site plan and minor site plan where it breaks those out. So it just helps identify some of the standards and how they apply. Some examples you might think of a commercial building that does an addition, and this helps understands which part of the code would apply and not. Again, new development, everything applies in Chapter 4, but this just is a table to help understand how some of those transitions or incremental improvements would be implemented. One area I wanted to point out is access and connectivity. This is a new section that was helped to improve decision-making. It was kind of dispersed throughout the existing UDO, so it identifies standards for driveways and access, pedestrian and bicycle circulation, and public transit. Again, there's standards there for access and connectivity and walkability. I'm looking at standards for sidewalk connections and, that are strengthened. Often you're looking at connections from the public street to the entrances of doors and things like that. Environmental and floodplain standards. There are many standards in the environmental section, looking at steep slopes, siltation and erosion, drainage, riparian buffers, karst geology, and wetlands. Many of these have been updated to align with best practices. There's some new standards in dealing with tree protection during construction. The floodplain standards have been separated out as a separate section. These were done to be more consistent with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources and the model floodplain guidance that they have. This section details the regulatory flood data and how we establish that, looking at flood hazard areas and how to reduce flood hazard reduction. And so again, that section was pulled out as a separate section to help clarify some of that language there. Parking and loading, again, one of the things that we look at parking is parking minimums and parking maximums. This chapter looks at how those are calculated, identifies those minimums, which are mostly for residential uses. So again, that establishes a minimum requirement of parking. And then in many places, in almost all uses, there's a parking maximum. As you know, oftentimes, other communities have an oversupply of parking, so we have parking maximums here. Looking at accessible parking needs, how adjustments are made to those calculations, looking at the location and design of where parking is put at, looking at loading, drive-through, bicycle parking, as well as the use of parking areas. So again, some of the breakouts of those are looking at parking standards for single-family residents were removed, so they're no longer minimum standards. Their minimum parking standards for plexes are set for a half a unit per dwelling unit. Maximum parking standards were updated and simplified, and we're looking at reducing the dimensional spaces, so looking at how much area is required for each parking space. So that's some of the dimensional standards talking about parking. And then we included standards for electric vehicle charging stations. One of the things that the Plan Commission did was originally they were sort of given, they weren't being counted, but there's a kind of a breakout. I believe it's 4 spaces doesn't count towards your maximum, and after that it starts counting towards a 1-per-1 ratio. Site building and design, this area is looking at kind of 4 categories at mixed use and non-residential. These are things that are looking at materials, the type of facades, what kind of patterns are being used on the building, eaves, the roof's pitch, 360-degree architecture, your entrances and windows that are used on site planning for your non-residential developments. Then you have your residential, again, similar categories, looking at materials, minimum coverage, foundation, that's just looking at the facades that the exterior is going down to the foundation, from the roof to the foundation, requiring rain gutters and downspouts, that there's uniform architecture and anti-monotony standards. Identified some criteria for refuse and recycling containers. It's also important to point out the neighborhood transition standards. This has been talked about several times. Again, when you're looking at some of the neighborhoods that are adjacent to higher or more intense uses, there's increased setbacks in lower building heights for those higher intense uses when they're adjacent to neighborhood areas. So again, it provides a nice buffer for that. And then again, we're carrying forward projects that are abutting historic buildings. There's again guidelines on how to orient and mass that structure adjacent to historic buildings. Incentives, this is one of the biggest changes in the UDO, and I think that I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the incentives. As you know, one of the main points of the UDO is trying to address affordable housing. The incentive section does allow for incentives for affordable housing. One that we've carried forward is waiver of fees. It's fairly minimal, but that's something that is, again, an incentive that we offer for affordable housing. When you're looking at affordable housing, it's available through either residential, non-residential, or student housing projects. There's a couple tiers in how that is done. Tier 1, it's 15% of the units need to be 15% of the, bless you, 15% of the units need to be affordable at a rate of 120% of annual median income. Tier 2, 7.5% of the units need to be less than 120% annual median income, and 7.5% have to be below 80% of annual median income. What do you get out of those affordability requirements? You get reduced bulk standards to, again, allow for some additional units to put in. At Tier 1, you'll get 12 feet of additional height allowed, and Tier 2, which is a bigger incentive, you get 24 feet or 1 story and respectively 2 stories as an incentive. There's location requirements, so obviously the priority is that we want affordable units to be within the project. There is a criteria or an allowance that these could be within 1,000 feet of the project, that they could be incorporated into a nearby site. And there is also a payment in lieu option. That's important to consider, especially for non-residential uses, to give that opportunity so that if a large employer were to move in town, there's a way to help offset the impacts that they might have on affordable housing, so that there's an opportunity for contributing for potential employees. There's sustainable development standards incentives. It's important to note that you can't double dip if you do both the affordable housing and the sustainable development. If you do the sustainable development, you're only allowed to do a Tier 1 on the affordability if you choose to do both. But there are 2 options if you do enter into the sustainable development incentive. Option 1, there's 6 criteria, and if you choose to meet 4 of those criteria, such as solar panels and other things, you get a 12-foot height bonus. Option 2, if you choose to enter in one of several certification programs, you can also use that as an option to get an additional height bonus. And that is all that I have. I know that was fast, but again, I understand that there's a lot of material in Chapter 4, and I wanted to give more opportunity for questions, and I'd be happy to answer those.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. What questions from council on Chapter 4? Councilmember Sturbaugh.
Yeah, the height issue that you just talked about, I think you said there's a 24-foot maximum. You can't get 24 plus 24 or 24 plus 12. Is that right? You can only get up to 24 total?
If you do the Tier 2 and the affordability just by itself, yes, you can get 24. There is I believe if you do the sustainability, you can get a half floor on that, on top of that. So it's
So
kind
that
of a
30 feet?
I have to look at the exact footage, but they have to have a reduced step back and footprint on that additional thing if they were to do that.
Okay, and then on page 145 about back-out parking, it says generally all on-site vehicle areas shall be designated to avoid the need for vehicles to back onto public streets when exiting public parking spaces. Does that apply across the board? Is that a ban on pull-in parking?
What page number was that? Councilmember?
145.
145?
It's 5A. 20.04.60.
I think what you're, it's the commercial not backing. Yeah, it's intended for commercial property so that you're not backing out onto the sidewalk and street, so.
So angled parking, you can't
This is on private property. We're not talking about on-street parking. This is on-site parking that they cannot back out into the public right-of-way.
Okay, I was that just caught my eye. On page 152, materials for mixed use and non-residential. Can we keep going? I forget how this works.
That's your warning.
Okay.
I was slow.
Question was, mixed-use non-residential, these can be primary building materials. Included is EIFS and transparent glass. Does that mean that the entire structure could be EIFS or the entire structure could be transparent glass? And my follow-up is what happened to primary and secondary materials?
Yes, hi, sorry, Jackie Scanlon, Development Services Manager. So they could, a primary building material is going to be 20% or more of a facade. So yes, they could be used for the entirety unless there are other pattern requirements that would have to be worked in somehow. So like an entirely glass building would probably not be able to meet the other requirements.
Okay, I just hate EIFS. We'll see what happens. Next.
Councilmember Sandberg.
Thank you. My question has to do with the payment in lieu, and that begins on page 201. Let's move to page 202, section B. During Plan Commission, we made a few tweaks to the serious concerns that were raised about how this particular mechanism is calculated, tracked, accounted for, and there was some call that City Council itself be the ones that set this policy or enact it, and the decision was made that states the provision of this section shall not become effective until the city adopts administrative procedures for calculating. So I wanted to give you as the staff an opportunity to maybe kind of address that a little bit and talk about what the city is doing in terms of being as transparent as possible with respect to the tracking, calculating formulas that go into the payment in lieu. And again, one of the listening sessions that I attended today, Amy Haas, our consultant who's walking us through this, said several, and there have been a couple of listening sessions already. This continues to be brought up, this pay-to-play, or that it's somehow a bribe, or and so I just want to give you an opportunity to address what mechanisms are currently in place.
Well, I believe this wouldn't even be effective until that would be done, which
Right,
is stated there.
right.
And so, yes, we're working hard on doing that, and one of the things that the Plan Commission included in this, as you can see, some of the methodology that we would be looking at. The fund currently now, Housing and Neighborhood Development, reports to City Council on how that money is appropriated and spent each year. We continue to support that and get that out. The city has a website identifying where those projects are receiving money. As far as the administrative function of how those rates are calculated, again, we've worked on the past couple of years in negotiating planned unit developments on those voluntary contributions and have a pretty good understanding on what things to consider that are listed in this list here, looking at, HUD values, annual median income, and those sort of things. There's utility rates and other things that are factored into that calculation. So, once the UDO is adopted, we fully expect to provide that information and have it out there to review. I mean, we have to do that in order for the payment in lieu to be effective anyway, or effective once it's adopted.
Okay.
So yeah, that's something that we've been continually working on, and we'd be happy to share that.
Thanks.
Councilmember Volin?
Yes, I had a couple of questions. One was, how do you calculate payment in lieu when a site won't have housing on it? I mean, I didn't quite follow how, or like, if the affordable housing wasn't on the site, how would payment in lieu be calculated?
So again, the calculation would be based on 15% of the units, and then that's the methodology is how that rate would be established. If you're talking about the payment in lieu if it wasn't on site.
Yeah, I mean, if you can go back to the slide where here we go. So location within 1,000 feet or payment in lieu option. So, I mean, what would the payment be? I don't quite fathom how that would be calculated.
Again, it's looking at the total number of units that are on the site and looking at the annual median income, looking at things such as rental rates, utility rates, ongoing rates from HUD, that those are updated regularly, and that's a calculation that would be shared with, once we get to that point here, that those rates would be clearly displayed on how those are calculated.
Do you see why I'm confused by it? Because I'm thinking, okay, so is it that the amount that you would have saved from putting utilities in, or I just don't understand the formula.
It's based on the number of units. The affordability is 15% of the units, so whatever that unit is, the calculation's based on that 15%.
Okay, it's based on it. So there's 15% of, they have to contribute 15% of the entire value of the building?
No.
Could you introduce yourself?
Sherry Porter, Director of Planning and
Hi,
Transportation.
Ms. Porter.
Hi.
They don't have to.
They don't have to. So the payment in lieu, we're actually still working on that to get that into a written policy. It's because of the different factors that change. We just don't have it written yet, but we are working on that. When the last project that came through, the CDG project, that was 15% of the beds times $20,000 per bed, is my understanding. Is how they came up with the
Okay, so just reclaiming my time, because I've got 10 seconds here. The $20,000 seems like an arbitrary number that it sounds like you're working on a less arbitrary formula, but if it's not in writing yet,
Right,
we're dealing with the writing of the UDO right now, aren't we?
yes,
We'll talk about it in the next round. Thank you.
thank you.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith?
Yes, I have some questions about portions that may encourage or discourage solar panels and growing your own food. So on page 92, and I'm going by the PDF pages, so let me see, what page is that in the actual 74? It's a section about soil quality. Is this only if the food is going to be sold to the public, that they have to get their soil tested and all that? I mean, if somebody just wants to plant tomatoes in their yard, do they have to go through all this?
Are you asking a question about Chapter 3?
No? Is that chapter 3? I don't think so.
You said page 72?
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's chapter 3.
I'll be happy to answer that, but, no,
I thought it was chapter 4.
the city wouldn't necessarily require that for, if my understanding of your question is, but, if you were to sell those produce, there would be an aspect that make sure the soil is of good quality. That's something that we wouldn't necessarily regulate on that, if I understand your question.
Well, but you're saying food products may be grown in soil native to the site if the applicant can provide documentation that these standards are followed. So if I want to plant lettuce in my yard, I have to give a soil sample, get it tested, and go to the city and all that? This is how I read this.
If you were going to sell it, that's the,
Well, then that should be put in here, that if you're going to sell it, you have to do this.
well, I'll have to follow up with you on that
Okay.
question.
I apologize that I went back too far in my text. I do have a couple questions about screening, page 195 of the PDF. So that's page 177. So there are a couple things here. First of all, the ground-mounted mechanical equipment. Letter B, small Roman numeral 3, screening of solar equipment is not required when it can be clearly demonstrated that the required screening would reduce efficiency or effectiveness of the solar energy. I just think screening adds to cost, and if somebody has a ground display, I want to allow that. I don't want to have more hurdles. So can we look at this again, because this seems like an extra hurdle that somebody would have to build a fence around their solar display.
Yes,
Is there, I'm sorry, that's a question, whether that was considered.
It was considered. So we received we did receive feedback that some people don't want to see their neighbors' ground-mounted solar arrays. And so I think that was put in there as a way for it to be included but not required if it was obviously going to make your system not work properly. But yes, we would be open to,
Taking it out.
yeah.
Thank you.
Further first-round questions? Yes, I'll ask. I've got a couple. Mr. Robinson, what is the longevity of the affordable housing that would receive those incentives?
It's permanent.
Permanent meaning, is it
In perpetuity.
Perpetuity, okay. And I had a question about landscaping, buffering, and fences. The list of species that we have is a good one, probably derived. These are plant species, ones that are considered invasive, non-invasive but not permitted, ones that are desired, et cetera. Those are from the DNR, is that right? Or where was that derived?
It was derived from, we had got feedback from the Tree Commission, we got feedback from Environmental Commission, staff reviewed
Okay.
plant lists, so yeah, it was a collection of feedback from people
Okay,
on that
and
list.
I know there's been some issues in the past with the implementation of this, that these, say, initially the desired species are put in but later replaced. how long do we investigate, or how long do we inspect?
I'm going to turn that over to Jackie Scanlon.
Okay.
So Jackie Scanlon again. Well, the idea is, and it says in code, and this is in current code as well, that they have to be in there in perpetuity. So we are currently in our Development Services Division working on a long-term inspection. So that is not something that has happened very reliably over time, but we are working toward that. And I know Senior Environmental Planner Linda Thompson is working with a SPIA fellow on catching up on some of the older site plans we have, and then we'll go from there. But moving forward, we'll be inspecting sites that we're currently issuing recommendations for occupancy on a regular, I would say we're going to try to do a yearly basis.
Yearly basis?
Yeah.
So they have to maintain those?
Yes, it is required. But right now, we only see those usually in an enforcement situation. If someone were to complain about it or something were to happen at a site, that's when we would remind them that they need to keep it up.
Okay, and while I'm on this, a developer could substitute plants for one another. Is there any sort of, so say, what I'm concerned about is like a monoculture, like all one species of tree as opposed to.
Sure, so I believe that there is a maximum percentage per species built in currently.
Okay.
So I can verify that, but I'm pretty sure that that's still in there. And that is how we try to regulate that.
Great, okay. All right, we're on to second round question. Councilmember Granger.
Thank you. I know we can't regulate what greenhouses and what they sell. Will there be any way that we could, at least let them know that we do have this list, that we're not permitting white mulberry, autumn olive, Russian olive? Just to let them know.
Yes, so yes, we are hopeful. I mean, that's part of the plan. So we have are kind of revamping our small enforcement two-person team, but landscaping is something that we've been focusing on. And yes, we plan, once the UDO is approved, to do like a outreach to the local, at least, the local, regional, to see. We often contact them when we find a place that has a lot of one thing that we would not prefer. We have called around to see, are you selling these in bulk, kind of, and working with them. So that's the plan, is to let them know once it's approved, kind of what we have.
Okay, so landscape companies and, do-it-yourself sort of.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Other first round questions? Seeing none, we'll go to second round now. Councilmember Sturbaum, I think, was first.
Right, so here's a for instance. Someone is going to put a duplex or a triplex in a core neighborhood, and neighbors show up and say, our peculiar condition is that there is not enough off-street parking, and the new parking that's going to be associated with the triplex is going to be a hardship for my neighborhood. However, 0.5 spaces per unit is all that's required. So for a triplex of 9 bedrooms, you have 1.5 parking spaces. Would that, in the conditional use hearing, would that overrule the concern of the neighborhood because they've met the criteria?
No, so I think this will be a jog of everyone's memory, but about 2 years ago when you approved the ADUs, I know that you went through what are the requirements for conditional use, and one of them is that you're not negatively affecting the neighborhood. So the BZA would be able to weigh that, and even though they are meeting the requirements, if they felt that it was going to have a detrimental effect on the neighborhood, then they could, in fact, choose to deny the conditional use request.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, I have a question about the floodplain standards. So this is page 117 in the document, 135 in the PDF. So the general standards here talk about new construction. New construction and substantial improvements shall be anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, or lateral movement of the structure. But why would we even allow new construction in a floodplain? it doesn't make sense to allow that, especially with climate change. It's going to be much more frequent that such structures would be flooded, so.
Sure, so I think that that's a valid question, of course, and this language, this part of our floodplain language, I believe, is modeled off of the state, and we had been asked, and they're trying to have municipalities have similar regulations across municipalities, and so they have a model ordinance. So they do recommend that you allow construction if it meets certain requirements, building above a certain level. I don't know, I would have to defer to legal, but I don't think that we are, necessarily obligated to do that in every situation. But that is where it kind of comes from. That's pretty typical in zoning codes, that it is allowed, but with certain restrictions, so that if there were to be a flood event, that the idea would be that the water would still be able to get through. It would be raised above the 100-year floodplain level, and there have other development requirements. But yes, I don't think that's something that you have to leave in. But again, I would leave that, I'm not positive on that.
Mr. Brooker, do you have anything to add from a legal perspective?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'd have to do some research, so I can certainly get back to you on it.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. Thanks.
Do you have any other questions, Councilmember?
Sure.
You still have
But
time.
30 seconds. Is gravel considered an improved surface?
It's what?
Is gravel considered
It
an
counts
improved-
against your impervious surface. It's not
It
grass. It's the opposite. It's not.
So it counts as
counts-
impervious.
Correct, because it has been shown repeatedly over time that that as it compacts over time, that it starts to function in a similar way as regular asphalt would, as far as water runoff and grabbing the grabbing the water and taking it off. It stops seeping through over time, so we always count it as impervious.
Thank you.
Councilmember Volin?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the difference in affordable housing in a project between height and mass. So if somebody wanted to build on a lot, say the size of the one next to the CVS on Kirkwood, but they wanted it to all be affordable housing, what kind of a limit would there be on its height? In other words, this formula seems to reward sort of the length of a building. But I mean, if you wanted dense housing in the center of town and it was all affordable, I mean, I'm completely spitballing, no one's proposing this, but would the limit just be 2 additional stories if they wanted to do a massive amount of affordable housing?
Yeah, in your scenario, these are minimum standards of affordability. So if they wanted to do 100% affordable, they would still get those same,
That's the only credit that they would get?
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Councilmember, if there is none, I'd like to actually ask one I meant to. In terms of the affordable housing, Councilmember Sturbaum and I in the last UDO put in some incentives. They weren't used. There was a sort of an approximation. We thought it would be attractive. Apparently it wasn't. How do you derive those? Those incentives, are they proven to work? In other words, the consultant, do they have evidence? Is this evidence-based?
Yes, it is evidence-based. They've worked in communities that have adopted these. There's generally a range, from my understanding, of 10 to 20% requirements. Kind of depends on your market conditions. You have to make the incentive enough to offset the cost. I mean, the housing cost is the real cost, so there has to be enough incentive there to offset the cost to provide that housing at a lower price.
Okay, so these are proven. Other council questions? We have a few minutes remaining.
Left.
Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah, a couple of fence issues have come up in the last year. One was at Second and Highland, one was at Euclid and Howe just recently, and they were all about the secondary facade. And, in our case, in the neighborhood, we supported that they use the transparent fence above the 4 foot on that secondary facade, and in the other one, they weren't allowed to bring it up to the property line. And for the life of me, I still can't understand why those were both not possible. And follow-up would be, how can we change the language? Because those were both in the interest of the homeowner. One had a dog, one had a peculiar condition of screening their yard. But, and in all intents of that amendment where we had transparency, so we could have a short fence on the secondary facade with open lattice above, I thought we had solved that problem. But in both of these cases, the fences weren't allowed to be built. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with one little piece of this fence ordinance. And I'd like, if you can't answer now, I'd like you to come back. Maybe you ought to talk, because none of us wanted to say no to these people, but we kind of had to. That's what I would like to figure out how we could fix that.
Yeah, we can talk more about, there may be other options than what was written, sure.
And I had a follow-up question that has nothing to do with fences, but, 90% of historic buildings are contributing. So this abutting historic buildings, that would even apply to the downtown. Abutting historic buildings excludes contributing buildings. I think that may have been an oversight.
Where are you looking, sorry?
I'm on projects abutting to historic buildings, which is 200470E, 5E, something like that.
Sure, just a second, sorry.
My page
On
number is
156.
156.
Yeah. And sorry, what's your question?
Did you mean to leave out contributing buildings, and do you realize that you're not relating to 90% of all historic property? Because contributing means it's an important piece of a form, but it isn't a standalone historic property.
Sure. Yes, I think that change was made. Let me look in the current code, because I think currently it's just if it's listed at all. But I don't think we feel strongly one way or another. I think it's okay to leave it as contributing. I think what has happened in the past, and we could look at the record, but I think sometimes when they are contributing, they have received deviations, and so it's mostly the outstanding and the notable that it has been used for, I think, was part of the reason that was changed. But I can look into that and let you know.
I didn't understand that, but...
Oh, I can say it a different way. I think outstanding and notable, because they're the higher rated, the focus was to make sure that those, that we kept in something to protect the sightline of those. But yes, I understand your point, and we'll look at that.
Thanks.
Pardon me? Any other council questions? We have about 2 minutes remaining. Seeing none, Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was in this area or another, but it seemed that there was an elimination of required neighborhood meetings, and I can't remember if that was for conditional use or for another proposal, but, neighborhoods had become accustomed to having someone be asked to meet with the neighbors, and it seemed that checklist was left blank.
Sure, so we can check on that. I think that might be in Chapter 6.
Okay.
But
I wasn't sure.
we
it
can
was in
check,
this
because yes,
chapter.
it's still required for PUDs, I know, and then we'll check, because the practice is that we always, if something's going to hearing officer or Board of Zoning Appeals, always have them contact the neighborhood association. And I don't actually think that's codified currently, but we'll check and make sure that gets in there.
Thank you.
With a minute remaining, any other questions from council before we go to the public? Okay, we now finish questions from council on Chapter 4. If the public has any comment, please step forward, state your name, sign in, and this is on Chapter 4 of the UDO.
Hi, Kate Rosenbarger. I wanted to talk a little bit about our parking minimums and curb cuts today from Chapter 4. So basically, I'm actually just going to read a little bit from Walkable City Rules by Jeff Speck, who, speaks at CNU all the time, wrote the book also Suburban Nation and all that good stuff. I mean, I'd really like to see us look at eliminating our minimum parking requirements, and spec writes here, the on-site parking requirement is probably the single greatest killer of urbanism in the United States. It prevents the renovation of old buildings since there's inadequate room on their sites for new parking. It encourages the construction of anti-pedestrian building types in which the building sits behind or hovering above a parking lot. It eliminates street life since everyone parks immediately adjacent to their destination and has no real reason to use a sidewalk. And finally, it results in a low density of development that can keep a downtown from achieving critical mass. All told, there's nothing to be said in favor of on-site parking requirements, and cities that wish to be pedestrian-friendly and fully developed should eliminate this ordinance immediately and provide public parking in carefully located municipal garages and lots, which we are doing. So many cities have eliminated on-site parking in their downtowns, and many are considering it. The expert on this is, of course, Shoup, who wrote The High Cost of Free Parking. And he says, removing off-street parking requirements will not eliminate off-street parking, but will instead stimulate an active commercial market for it. Developers will always meet the market. Their financing usually requires parking anyway. But different developers should be able to meet different markets, and cities shouldn't get in the way of a one-size-fits-all auto-centric requirement. So I think that's pretty interesting to consider, or at least look at our parking minimums again here. And then a little bit about curb cuts. I mean, we are in a climate crisis, of course, so trying to cut down on curb cuts, pun intended, is, I think, pretty useful. Spec here says every driveway that crosses a sidewalk presents a potential danger to people walking and biking who may be hit by a vehicle crossing their path. This danger makes the sidewalk feel less safe and comfortable, a feeling that is reinforced by the tilt of the driveway, skirt, and the missing curb. Additionally, curb cuts eliminate on-street parking that would otherwise protect the sidewalk edge, resulting in a visual widening of the street that encourages illegal speeds. New curb cuts should never be allowed for any use if the property is adjacent to a public alley, which our downtown has, that provides alternative access. When they are allowed, they should be no more than 10 feet per lane, so 20 feet across. And right now in the UDO, ours is 34 feet, so it's just taking that from the previous UDO, and I think if we don't want to disallow them, we could at least look at narrowing them. If anyone wants to borrow this book, you may.
Thank you for your comment. Make sure you remember to sign in.
Peter Dorfman. Before I get into my question, I just want to ask the parliamentarian the procedure for this. I want to ask a question. Can I ask a question and then donate back the rest of my 3 minutes for you to answer it?
Well, we don't take questions, but we might entertain an answer when we come back to comment, so we're not going to have an exchange.
Okay.
But
So
you may ask a question and we will
I
attempt
will
to
just
answer
ask
it.
the question and then sit down. So Councilman Sturbaum raised an interesting question about neighborhood objections to conditional use applications that are within compliance. If a neighbor has an objection, who feels that there is a hardship being posed by this compliant use application, would it be useful to codify what kind of hardship could be claimed, what kind of application could be made? Would the UDO be a place to codify it, or is there some other document or ordinance that would be a good place for that? That's my question. Is there a place to codify the way to object to a conditional use application that is in compliance?
Thank you.
Again, please sign in after you speak so that we
I'm
can keep it
Michelle
moving.
Henderson. I live on the near west side, and the streets are narrow there. At this point, people are parked on both sides. Parking is crowded. I just yesterday was driving toward town, and there was a school bus, and the school bus could not get past. There was no way for a car going east to allow for a school bus going west. So there was a whole backing up kind of situation. That was, you know, a little annoying with a school bus, but if it were a, you know, a fire engine trying to get to a fire, I don't know how they would get there. That's in our current situation right now on the near west side on 6th and 7th Street. The streets are narrow. If there aren't, if there's no off-street parking allowed with any new buildings that come in, I don't know, it just seems like it's not going to be safe. Cars are parked along both sides of the street. Children are playing in the yards. It seems like someone should take into account in terms of when you encourage density, please also encourage the safety of the neighborhood residents and the, you know, what's going to be best for city services, both in terms of school buses and emergency services. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Jean Simonian, and I also have a question. I wonder if we could put up the incentives on the overhead again? Turn that on. Yeah. Okay, my question is about the affordable housing incentives. It was, if I understand this, it was stated that those agreements are valid in perpetuity. What I'd like to get clarification on is, does that in perpetuity hold if there's a transfer of ownership of the building? Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew Gunther, Chair of the Bloomington Environmental Commission. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you all for, again, doing these UDO meetings. I know they can be quite the effort. I wanted to state that the Environmental Commission, we came over a month now ago to let you know that we had nearly 100 amendments and comments we wanted to see enacted in the UDO. We then moved forward to asking staff to draft those changes. We recently received the drafts back. The Environmental Commission decided not to move forward those amendments that were drafted by staff. We'll be drafting our amendments by ourselves this weekend, and then we'll be inviting council members to come meet with us and Senior Environmental Planner Linda Thompson to sponsor amendments that they see fit. So I want to just publicly state that we will be inviting council to those meetings, and I encourage any council members that wish to attend and sponsor Environmental Commission amendments to attend those meetings, and expect that email within the week. Thank you.
Thank you for that invitation.
Hi, my name is Sandra Clothier. I live on the Near West Side. I have just a couple of questions. I'm looking at the incentives, and I'm wondering if someone added on to their home and wanted to build an additional 2 units, and one of those is affordable housing, does that mean that that house would be allowed to have that extra 24 feet? And I'm also asking that if somebody had an ADU and it was affordable, how does that impact the extra height or other considerations? Secondly, I'd also request that when we talk about affordable housing, we talk specifically about what we're talking about when we talk about affordable housing. For instance, the Beeline Heights, which has just been built, has 1, 2, I'm not sure, 3 or 4, I'm not sure how many bedrooms they have. A 1-bedroom is over $600. A 2-bedroom is over $800. I think that it is really important as we move forward on these deliberations that we understand what we talk about when we talk about affordability. This is fine for workforce housing. It does meet that criteria. It does not meet criteria for low-income folks. It does not have, that's not an affordable amount for someone to pay if they are making less than, maybe say $15,000, $20,000 a year. They're not going to be able to afford any of that. Additionally, a 2-bedroom, we assume, that's fine, students or singles who are pairing together and are each able to pay an amount towards that, that's fine. But if we're talking families, and we talk $800 for a family of a single parent and a child, or we say maybe the family's larger, 3 or 4 people in the family, where is affordability? And I think that we just easily gloss over these numbers or these ideas without really clarifying what we're talking about. And I think that is so critical when we talk about building affordability into situations. And as a further comment, when we're talking about 10 units and we're talking about 1 unit being affordable and getting an extra 10 feet, I think that's an awfully huge return on 1 apartment being affordable. I just think we need to really always question these things and make sure that what we're approving is something we really intend to approve. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Further comment from the public? Okay, we're back to council then for another round of questions. Who would like to begin? Councilmember Volin.
Okay, I heard a number of questions. I think we'll get to them all at some point. One thing I'd like to know is, can we have a brief review of what the different levels of affordability are? What are are the terms mentioned in the, I went searching for it through the new draft and I couldn't find 30, 60, 80%. Are they in here somewhere? Anybody?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? You don't know where 30,
In other words,
80?
Ms. Clothier was talking about, what defines affordability. We've got workforce housing at above 80% AMI. What do we call, there's levels below that.
Right.
That are technically called affordable. Can we review those briefly?
So the actual rates are not in the UDO because those change annually. I can respond to the Beeline Heights question. I don't know what the rents are, but I do know that that's a tax credit project, so that has federal dollars. So the rents that are charged are what would have been approved by HUD to be able to charge. So, but I don't know what the specific rents are.
Well, I mean, I know that we've talked about, I know that the rates change every year, but there's still sort of standards like 30% of AMI is extremely low income and below.
Yeah, below 60% is extremely low income.
Okay, but sorry, there were, I've seen standards at below 80, below 50 or 60, below 30.
Right.
And they each have a different name. Low, very low, extremely low. Am I
No,
making this up?
you're correct, and those typically go with the HOME program, which is a federal funding program that Bloomington gets home dollars.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to get that list sometime,
Sure.
so that we at least know what we're talking about. But I take it that the projects we're concerned about are mostly of workforce housing between, so 80% AMI you consider to be low income.
80%, yeah,
Below
below
80%.
80% is low income.
And below 120 is workforce.
Between 80 and 120,
Okay.
yes.
The other question briefly is Mr. Dorfman's question on conditional use objections. Do you have an answer for him? Thank you.
I don't have an answer, I'm sorry.
I was going to follow up on your other question on
We'll
the
do that then, because I'm almost out of time, so.
affordability. I think the reason why we're targeting these, because these are affordable price ranges that are not typically eligible for federal funding dollars. So when you're looking at home, they're targeting those lower income brackets. So that's why these ranges are being targeted as incentives. Your other question about criteria, there is criteria in Chapter 6. We can get into that, but generally there's criteria about consistency with the comprehensive plan and those broader guidance.
I'm content with Chapter 6. We'll take it up next week. Thank you.
Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah, first to follow up on
It's Chapter 7.
what is our 80% AMI, roughly?
My understanding is that it's $48,500 for a family of 4.
What's the rent that would be accompanying that?
I don't know. I don't have that. I can find out.
Was there a recent project?
Councilmember Sturbaum, I don't think your mic is on.
Thank you. Was there a recent project that had a rent that you can recall that was in that category?
I can't answer that
I
question.
can't either.
I can't answer that question, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I will find out for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. So the other question is, this is development standards, incentives, variations in texture, color elements shall repeat vertically a minimum of every 30 feet. There are incredible historic properties that do not do this. And sometimes this results in checkerboard design of large buildings. Can an architect get a waiver from this, or does he have to design with the handcuffs of these rules of it has to go up and down a little bit, it has to have different materials and change the color? And do you know about that? Because it seems that it ties the hands of an architect.
Rules, not handcuffs. But, but yes, I do think that under the new UDO, I think they would be obliged to do that, but I will check. I mean, you're talking about like how under the current rules, Plan Commission does the deviations, and that's how sometimes that gets changed.
Yeah,
I will verify that for you.
We've all seen when that
I
kind
know
of
what
goes
you mean.
haywire.
Yeah, for
And
sure. Thank you.
I would like to see a way to allow that not to be the dictating design, driving the design. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I wanted to take up this question raised by a member of the public about driveway widths. And page 143 is where this is addressed. Letter B, 1, 2, says, in the R3 zoning district, the maximum width of a driveway shall be 18 feet. Why is this not applied to the other residential districts?
Well, it's a carryover from the current code where it only applies in the RC currently. They have, the RS has a different standard. So whenever the UDO was approved last time, the focus apparently, I think, I mean, just from working with it, was on minimizing the new street cuts in the RC zoning districts. And so that was carried forward to the R3.
Do you see any problem with applying that to all the residential districts rather than 24 feet?
No. I don't personally.
Okay. Great. So then I have another question about the windows and open space requirements on the first floor that we see in a lot of the downtown area. Is there anything in this new UDO that would prevent a situation like we see at Urban Station next to the Chocolate Mousse, where it was supposed to be open area, but it's kind of translucent glass, and behind it there's just stairs? And it really does not add anything to pedestrian value at the street level.
Yes and no. This kind of goes, I think, to Mr. Sturbaum's question that I will verify. I think a lot of those buildings that we have that I mean, we have those over town where it's kind of like the faux first floor windows, were approved via the deviation process, that it was kind of, trying to go toward giving that pedestrian interest or just not having it be a blank wall. I'm not certain how that carries over. Just off the top of my head, I'm not certain how that carries over to the new. Scott might know.
I think another point that the UDO is doing is loosening some of the first floor commercial requirement, and that's some of the issues that I think we're seeing on some of those projects. So there's still areas where it's required for non-residential on the first floor, but you can have like a 20-foot setback for residents on the first floor, so that might be able to address some of those kind of weird design things that developers are trying to do with that.
So because the new document decreases the area where it's required to have commercial on the ground floor, If there's residential on the ground floor in the downtown, are they required open space?
It's
Void to
loosened up,
solid?
it's made it more flexible so that it's not as strict to have non-residential just on the first floor. So
Okay.
that might help address some of the design, architectural design aspects.
Well, if Ms. Scanlon could get back to me.
Yes, we will.
On that, thank you.
Councilmember Granger.
Thank you. I'm questioning the whole floodplain section, not questioning the whole thing. So this is a change from what has been, so now we are allowed to build in a floodplain if we are a residential facility. Is that correct?
I don't believe it's a change. I'm sorry, we've gone back and forth with this very many times during this. Let me check on that briefly. If you have do you have another question?
No, we can
Okay.
come back to that, thank you.
Let's move on to Councilmember Sandberg, and then we'll return.
Thank you. With respect to incentives, and I was just reminded when I ran into Phil Stafford out in the hallway before this meeting, with incentives, was there ever any discussion about universal designs being part of that maybe package of things that builders could do in order to accommodate, again, our populations who are needing first floor and designs of their apartments that accommodate wheelchairs, et cetera?
Yeah, there were things that we discussed with the consultant with that. The challenge with a lot of the universal design standards apply through building codes, and that's stuff that we typically don't review and enforce. So the standards are site planning, orientation, building height, setbacks. Generally, the universal design's looking at doorway widths and countertop heights and minimum thresholds to get inside the property. So those get to be a little bit more challenging to implement with a zoning code or ordinance.
So if that could not be considered as part of an incentive requirement, is there any language in this document that addresses a real desire on behalf of people with disabilities for better universal designs in our new structures?
I believe that there is some requirements for accessibility, and I have to refresh my memory where that is. I do know with the incentives, all the affordable units have to be the same flavor as the regular units, so they have to, match the same type of amenities. They have to look the same. They can't be of a lesser quality.
Okay. And then while I still have a little bit of time, in answer to the question about the perpetuity and affordable housing, what is the answer to that? That if the building is sold, that still is the case, right? Or
That's correct.
that's correct, okay.
Ms. Scanlon, do you have an answer yet, or do
Yes,
you
I
need more
do.
time?
Okay, sorry. So in the current iteration of the code now, you would have to get a variance to do that. So the state regulation is the 2 foot above the 100-year flood elevation, and that we would be adding that in. We would be leaving in we have currently additional development standards, certain permitted and conditional uses outside of buildings that we have in the code now that are carried forward, you see in the proposed floodplain as well. So yes, it would be less restrictive in some, yes, it's less restrictive.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Further questions? Councilmember Volman. Well, let me ask one then. Let's see what was remaining from. Well, there was a question from Ms. Rosenberger about minimum parking standards. Do you want to address that? How did we come to the minimum parking standards that we're requiring, as opposed to just abolishing them completely?
You're talking about the residential minimum requirements?
Mm-hmm.
It's a balancing act. I think you've heard a lot of testimony just recently about parking concerns in areas and demands of public parking on street parking. So it was a balance. They were lowered, in many cases. Again, we're overall, our parking standards, when the consultant reviewed our section, were very progressive in our parking standards compared to many communities that typically just do the minimum standard and they don't have any maximums. We have maximums, and the minimum requirements are fairly low.
Councilmember Volin.
No, I don't think I had any. I think I just wanted to talk about conditional use objections, but that's going to be a Chapter 6 thing. So, thank you.
Just to clarify, regarding the question from Ms. Simonian, Councilmember Sandberg asked about the perpetuity of affordable housing that appears in the deed of the property. Is that correct? How is that enforced over?
I think it would be part of a recordable commitment, or, you know, the city would have to relinquish that. I'd have to double check on that language, but that's been a pretty strong commitment that we'd be working so hard to get these units. We want to make sure that they're around for a long time. So that's the direction we've been taking.
I see. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Seeing none, then we'll move on to council comment, correct? Is there council comment on Chapter 4? Councilmember Sturbaum, did you?
Yeah, this is kind of big picture, but Peter Calthorpe is a new urbanist who one of the founders of New Urbanism, and is one of the people that the proponents of the upzoning have been quoting from. I just thought it might be interesting if I read a little bit from this book, his latest. In addition, the idea of conservation in urban design applies to more than energy, carbon, and the environment. It also applies to preserving and repairing culture and history, as well as ecosystems and resources. Conserving historic buildings, institutions, neighborhoods, and cultures is as essential to the vital living urbanism as is preserving its ecological foundations. New York City may have among the smallest carbon footprint per capita, but to solve the climate change crisis, we do not all have to live in the city. Urbanism is, in fact, our single most potent weapon against climate change, rising energy costs, and environmental degradation. Yet our towns, cities, and regions cannot be shaped around a single issue like climate change or peak oil, no matter how critical they may be. Urban design is part art, social science, political theory, engineering, geography, and economics. I believe it is necessarily all of the above. Urban design cannot and should not be reduced to any single metric. In the end, great urban places are qualitative. They are ultimately defined by the coherence of their public places, the diversity of their population, and the opportunity they create for our collective aspirations. We will never treasure our cities and towns just because they are low carbon, energy efficient, or even economically abundant. We will treasure them only when we come to love them as places, as vessels of our cultural identities, stages for our social interaction, and landscapes for our personal narratives. But that does not mean they should not also play a critical role in the climate change challenge. So balance is what we need, and vision is what we need, and knowing our local city, loving it, caring for it, being very careful how we take care of it. That is our mission, and that is our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Volin.
Well, I think it also happens that the places, the cities that we treasure happen to be the ones that are the most compact, the most efficient for people on foot. That's why one of the big focuses that I have is parking, and I have for a long time. I was interested in Ms. Henderson's concern about the safety of neighborhood residents on the near west side with the narrow street with parking on both sides, and the concern about fire trucks. The concern about what happens if we don't require parking in residential areas. First of all, no one's going to take away existing parking on existing properties, but anything new there's no particular reason to require them to provide parking on their house. If 95% of a neighborhood's built out anyway, it's not going to make much of a difference, number one. Number two, the solution to managing parking problem in a neighborhood is that's Mr. Sturbaum's time. I forgot to reset the time. I'll stop early. Is a neighborhood parking zone. We have done a dozen of them since 1992, and we did them at first in reaction to students wanting to commute to IU once IU stopped trying to restrict freshmen or any student from having cars. But they work extremely well. We undercharged for those zones for 25 years. We only recently raised the rate to $45 a year. It's a very reasonable price, and you'll be surprised how much parking becomes available when you start regulating your neighborhood zone. Secondly, why is it that children should be restricted to playing in yards? Why can't we have streets that are safe enough that children can play in the street? That is a tradition in many cities over millennia. Streets don't have to be wide. We should be concerned about a fire truck being able to get through, but the answer there is to take away a lane of parking to make room for that fire truck. If you do that, beware, you're going to start having people speeding like they do on my street, which only has parking on one side, and they zoom past because it's a 2-block street without a break. But that's a key thing. I support the complete elimination of parking requirements, and we'll be proposing an amendment to that end. But that's not going to eliminate parking. It's just going to stop the expansion of parking, which we already have plenty of, absolutely plenty of. We don't need any more. We need to regulate what we have better. Finally, this will save for the next week when we talk about Chapter 7, but two things I found were not actually defined in the plan as it is. On page 202, it defines the U.S. EPA. It says EPA, but then it says Housing and Urban Development. It doesn't say it's the U.S. Housing and Urban Development. That's the only mention of it in the UDO, so we should address that. Also, area median income itself is not defined in the definitions section. We need to define it. And that might also be an opportunity to explain what are the different levels of area median income that we think about when we think about workforce, affordable, low income, very low income, whatever the terms are, we should get them all in. With a document this thick, with this being such an issue, we should have those things defined. Finally, I admit to not quite understanding the affordable housing incentives, and I'm going to work with staff to better understand those definitions, the formula for calculating it. And there was a good question about from Ms. Clothier about whether they apply to single-family zones. I mean, I don't think they do, but it's a question worth getting straightened out. So those are my thoughts.
Councilmember Piedmont-Smith.
Yes, I wasn't going to comment, but then Councilmember Sturbaum made a comment that was really obviously about Chapter 3, which we're not supposed to be commenting on, that I thought, well, I need to bring up once again climate change, global warming. I listened to the quote that he read from the New Urbanist. I think what people fail to grasp is that life in 20 years is not going to be anything like life now. Okay, we need a new paradigm. Single-family housing basically is not sustainable. We can't keep having every family in a separate house with a lawn around it. It's not something that our environment can support. We need to drastically change the way we live. We need to live in a more compact, energy-efficient way. And we can love our neighborhoods, and I love my neighborhood. It's a historic neighborhood. But the fact is, it's not gonna, our whole existence as we know it now is not gonna be the same. I mean, we can love our neighborhoods, but there's gonna be nothing left to love if we don't drastically change the way we live. And I'm not just talking about Bloomington, I'm talking about everybody. But here in Bloomington, we do have the benefit of not being on a coast where the we're going to be, submerged in the ocean, but we are going to have to deal with climate change refugees. We are going to have to deal with the fact that food is going to be more scarce, that gasoline is going to cost, $50 a gallon, that things are going to be much more localized out of necessity. And so when I look at Chapter 4, which we're supposed to be commenting on, I think it's very irresponsible to allow people to build in a floodplain, because floodplains, 100-year floods are going to come every 5 or 6 years now. I think it's really irresponsible of us to make it any more difficult to grow local food than it already is. I think we need to make it as easy as possible to have solar panels, not require screening. And I think that the walkability that Ms. Rosenbarger spoke of is very important as well. Why do we need 24-foot driveways? There's no reason for it. Let's go to shared driveways instead. It's because we're going to not be using cars as much. We're going to be walking. And what makes it safer to walk is fewer curb cuts. So these things all add up. And that's really the lens through which I look at this whole ordinance, and I really wish people would look at the whole ordinance, even though it is a huge document. But we just have to realize that business as usual is going to be impossible in a few decades. And the more we delay in changing our paradigm, the less possible it will be to thrive on this planet in the future. Thank you. Or even survive, for that matter.
Further council comments? I wasn't intending to say something, but I'll just add, I don't disagree with Councilmember Piedmont Smith, and I frankly don't disagree with Councilmember Sturbaum. I think that in order to cope with change in the future, we will need social cohesion. We will need to be a resilient community. We'll have to depend on each other. And I think that there is a place for different housing types. I think that I can see, I've already seen naturalization of single-family lots for wildlife, for gardens, and so forth. So I think that that kind of adaptation can occur with density increases, but it needn't be sacrificing a built environment that we already reside in that has that cohesion and is proven. So with that, do we have time remaining for comment? Everyone's had their comment. Councilmember Sturbaum wants 30 seconds.
I just wanted to say that the core neighborhoods were built before automobiles. The original green, when people had to walk, when there wasn't fossil fuel. And I think they're going to be relevant in 10 years. Thank you.
Councilmember Volin has 30 seconds.
If they were built for an automobile, then nobody should be asking for requirements for more automobiles. That's the thing. We're talking about to provide a minimum requirement for automobiles in new residential. And for single-family houses, there shouldn't be a requirement. That doesn't mean that people won't build it, but there shouldn't be a requirement for it.
So we need to go back to...
Now we're having a debate, Councilmember Sturbaum.
All right. I think that concludes Councilmember Ruff. You have 1 minute, 30 seconds remaining.
No, he has 4 minutes.
It won't take me long. I just want to follow up on Councilmember Piedmont Smith's comment. I agree that we're looking at, I'm convinced, thoroughly convinced, as she is, that we're looking at a radically different future way of living forced upon us by environmental change that will also have tremendous social and economic change that goes along with it. And, I don't pretend to understand what all those implications will be for our communities and for lifestyle, but I have to think that in a future of reduced habitability of large areas, of economic and social upheaval, that cities, urban environments are likely not to be a place where we're going to be able to have people living. People will need to move there'll be much more people, large numbers of people involved in food production. Councilman Piedmont-Smith mentioned relocalizing food production. So we're going to see, I think, if the change is as radical as several members of the public have expressed that they think it will be, if we're looking at that kind of dramatic change, I don't think we're looking at cities continue to grow. I don't see that Bloomington will be needing to accommodate large numbers of refugees. I think people will be inhabiting the countryside and having to grow more and more local food. We're not going to have massive fossil fuel inputs and fertilizer inputs and pesticide inputs into mass agriculture by huge, diesel equipment. We're going to need, people are going to have to return to a lifestyle that's very different from this. So I don't think we can pretend to predict the urgency of, I just don't believe personally that under these kind of changes that we're going to need to accommodate large urban populations that will no longer be able to be sustained by massive, intense agriculture run by very few people. It's going to be agriculture run by much more people, more labor intensive, and will not lead to massive population of the cities. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we've now exhausted council comment, unless anyone else who hasn't spoken. All right, we'll move on now to Chapter 5, Subdivision Standards. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. This is going to be a very short presentation on subdivision, just for everyone's understanding. This is typically when somebody comes in to subdivide their land. When they do that, there are certain requirements that are required, such as right-of-way dedication and other things, so there are standards in that process. This is how the chapter is organized. It consolidates all the standards for how land is subdivided within the community. There are 4 subdivision types. One is called infill subdivision, IS. It has a 3-acre maximum, so again, that's designed for your kind of small-scale subdivision. That's new in the code. There's a conservation subdivision that's a carryover from the current UDO that has a 5-acre minimum requirement. There's a traditional subdivision that is, again, carryover from the current UDO that's a 3-acre minimum. And then there's a commercial/employment subdivision. There are no minimum parent lot size requirements on that. The type of standards that are typically looked at in this chapter are, the general provisions, easements. They come in different flavors. We have utility easements, conservation easements, karst easements, pedestrian easements. So there's a section on that. Looking at various design standards, block length and intersections and those sorts of things. Lot sizes, some of this is looking at, the parent size tract and other tracts. Monuments and markers, these are things to help identify where the lots are. Open space requirements, stormwater requirements, right-of-way. So when, again, on some of your larger subdivisions, there will be dedications of right-of-way, and those public improvements are required as part of that. And then utilities, where the utilities go, and what have you. The little image on the right is an example of a breakout of the traditional subdivision. So it looks at the parent tract. Again, I mentioned that's 3 acres. It has base zoning where it applies. So this is mostly looking at your residential districts. 5% of the areas required for open space. Looking at alley serviced lots, the percentage of that, maximum block length. Cul-de-sacs aren't permitted. Looking at right-of-way standards, references the transportation plan that was just recently approved. Looking at on-street parking, the tree plot width, that's the width between the sidewalk and the curb where the grass plot is, and again, the requirements for sidewalks. So this just gives you a snapshot of one of the districts. It's fairly similar for the others, they just have different standards. So that's not all that I have on this chapter. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. We'll go to council for questions. Councilmember Volin.
Thank you. I got in a conversation yesterday about the idea of condominiums in the would-be plexes. If somebody wanted to build a duplex and then make it 2 separately owned units, is that feasible under Bloomington or Indiana code? I'm not sure if Mr. Rooker could answer this or Mr. Robinson, but it does seem like a reasonable thing to create home ownership through plexes. Is that feasible?
Yeah, so they do that now. I mean, that is something that is used in the city, and also, I guess I'm more familiar with it in the county. So where it's like condoized. I believe when Trinitas came before you with the project at 17th and Arlington, they discussed being able to do that without actually having to subdivide, that they could, I'm not familiar with how that would be done, but it's like a horizontal
Property regime.
Thank you. So I believe that would be possible, and we can verify that, but that's my understanding.
Okay, so to your knowledge, if somebody wanted to build a plex, they could make it a condominium of 2, 3, or 4 units, and those could be separately owned.
Yes.
Do we know if it's legal in Indiana to put a restriction or a covenant on that plex so that no more than one unit could be owned by one person? In other words, would it be possible to restrict somebody from owning more than one unit in that plex?
You mean for the government to say that, or for them to do that themselves?
Either way.
There are condos in town that do that.
For us to require that be...
I don't know if we could require
Yeah,
it.
maybe Mr. Rooker can answer that.
Yeah, so we're looking at some of those owner restrictions that came up, I think, yesterday as well. Those tend to be limited, but we want to do a little bit more of a comprehensive study on that before we give you a firm answer. But there are some cases out there that suggest those sorts of restrictions are discouraged.
So, wait, I'm not following. You're saying that the state discourages?
A local ordinance that would say in a plex that was organized into a condominium, you could only own one unit in that plex. I think that was your question, is that right?
Why would they frown upon that?
Well, generally, local zoning regulations that regulate the identity of an owner, right, that oftentimes those are not received well by courts. But again, we want to do a little bit more research on that before we give you a firm answer on that. I think Scott mentioned that at the top of his presentation on Chapter 4 as well. So,
thank you.
Councilmember Chopra.
My question is whether or not, during the Plan Commission hearing on this chapter, whether or not there were proposed amendments.
You're challenging my memory.
Good.
Yeah, there were, I'm not aware of any amendments on Chapter 5.
No hot button issues.
No.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Councilmember Sturbaum.
So an ADU that's attached, that's a pretty simple way to have an owner and another person living in those. It's kind of like an owner duplex. But if you made a duplex out of an old house and then thought you could condoize it, wouldn't there be restrictions about how you had to have firewalls and certain building restrictions that would keep you from just condoizing an old house? Like, I get row houses, those are easily, and they're built for condos. And I think Councilmember Volin's question was about new construction that would be built for condos. But I don't know how you would condoize a little old house that had a zigzagging non-flame resistant division between the two houses.
My understanding is, but again, we can verify this, that if you were doing a remodel of an old house, that the issues with firewall between units wouldn't come up if you went to condoize it. It would come up when you were doing the remodel to create the separate units. that you would have to have those in at that time. But you probably know more about that intimately than I do, but we can verify that. I think that so building code is enforced by Monroe County Building Department, so we are not intimately involved, but I can find that out to verify when those types of requirements come into play.
Right. And then there are a lot of deep lots that could be subdivided, and then you'd have ownership. You take one lot that's owned, and it's subdivided into 2 lots so that you now have 2 homes on what used to be a single property. And that's something was done a lot in the traditional neighborhoods before zoning. And how do we address that now? And do any of our minimum lot sizes make that more easily done?
Sure. So we still have the requirement, I believe, that you have to have frontage. So, for example, when we had the subdivision that was slightly controversial last year or the year before on East 2nd, where they had frontage on 2nd and then just a small amount of frontage on Anita on the south side, that's why they were able to do that subdivision. They had more than enough land to do it, but if they didn't have frontage on both roads, they couldn't have done
So
it.
a corner lot clearly has frontage both ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And my question was, did the reduction in lot size make that easier to do? Was that a conscious part of the change, or was there any attention made to subdividing long, deep corner lots in the urban core?
I don't think that was an intent. I can let Scott speak to that.
This was an amendment that was dealt with at the Plan Commission. The intent was dealing to help lower land costs, I guess, when you're looking at lot sizes, so that was the general intent. There was a lot of comments referencing some newer developments on Dunn Street and along the Beeline Trail, that those single-family lots are fairly small, that why couldn't we have some smaller lots? So there was a evaluation of looking at existing lots, and the Plan Commission felt that there was some room to kind of go down, comparing it with the existing lot sizes are in many of the single-family districts.
Because it is another way to add density and respect ownership.
It could be, depending on what the characteristics of a particular lot is, yes.
Right.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, I have a couple questions about easements. I understand that maintenance of the easement is the responsibility of the property owner. What is the enforcement mechanism for that?
Sorry, you said what is the enforcement? I missed the end.
The enforcement mechanism, how is that enforced, the maintenance of the easement?
Similarly to other site plan requirements, if it's done through a subdivision process, and then we check and make sure that it's installed properly and maintained properly at while they're doing the construction, and then over time, it's something that we typically only address on an enforcement complaint basis.
Complaint, okay. And then on the other side of the coin, in particular for a drainage easement, it says, this is page 213, drainage easement shall provide that the owner of the lot on which the easement is placed shall be responsible for maintenance of the drainage features. But what if the stormwater that what if it originates off-site, and because of the flow of stormwater, the impacts on the property owner's site keep getting worse and worse, and is there any recourse for that property owner?
Sure, so we get that kind of call semi-regularly. I mean, we've had probably a few this year, and that typically goes to the drainage engineer for the city who works at City of Bloomington Utilities. My understanding is that the state regulation is like water as the common enemy, which ends up being that, if you're at the bottom of the hill, it's kind of your responsibility to take care of it, even if development above is making it worse. So that's not something that we typically are super involved in, but I can check with Mr. Peden to verify exactly what recourses are available to property owners when they are affected by off-site water changes.
Well, if you, with this hypothetical, if there's a approval for a development up the hill, when you approve that development, don't you have a requirement that the runoff is
Yes.
less or
Yes,
equal
completely.
to?
So we mostly see it in a single-family situations where they would maybe be doing someone might be doing small changes to their yard or property that then negatively affect a neighbor. Not in a substantial way, but just small changes. That's usually where we get calls on that.
Mr. Rooker, did you have something to add?
Yeah, and I just wanted to confirm what Jackie said without reference to Mr. Peden. We're what we call a common enemy doctrine state, which means that storm or surface water like that is considered a common enemy, and each property owner is free to take whatever precautions they need to without regard to downstream property owners. So,
I think we'll be seeing more of our common enemy in the coming years.
We're on council questions, first round. Any other first round questions? I had one for Mr. Rooker, just a clarification. Among things that you're researching, the question came up about requiring owner occupancy of duplexes. Is that something that you are examining?
yes, absolutely. I believe that question was raised last night, and we're thinking about that right now.
Very good, thanks. Second round questions? Councilmember Volin.
I wanted to ask also about the subdivision standards. It wasn't in the summary. Have we made it possible through the new proposed code to reduce the minimum size lot that can be subdivided? I mean, can we make smaller lots than we used to?
Yes, so the minimum lot sizes changed in some, or are being proposed to be changed, right,
Right.
in some of the districts. So then those would be the minimum lot sizes that you
So, yeah, how much
could
smaller
seek.
can a minimum, is a minimum size of a lot now than it used to be?
Well, you have to look at the base zoning, chapter 2 on the base zoning, what the minimum lot sizes are, and then the districts show which of the subdivisions apply to those districts. So I think like the commercial districts, there's not a minimum lot size, but the residential there are.
I mean, and I was just curious, on the residential ones, are they?
I think if you look at the R3, it's 7,200 right now, and it's down to 5,000.
Okay, so in most of the zones,
You know, we
they're
created the new RE, so the R2 is a district that was a kind of a gap to fill in the gap. The RS or the R2 district, I have to remember, but that one, there was some reductions in all the minimum lot sizes.
They're certainly not, the minimums aren't increasing, I take it? They're
No,
decreasing.
they've all been
Very good,
lowered.
thank you.
Councilmember Sturbaugh?
Yeah, just another mega question about mapping. We wouldn't be precluded from changing commercial to residential or mixed-use residential, would we? I mean, we're mapping, we're just changing zones.
Can you restate your question? I'm sorry.
I jumped ahead to the mapping and I said, we wouldn't be precluded from changing commercial zoning to mixed-use residential.
Yeah, again, that's a mapping question that would come up. I would point out that a lot of the permitted uses in Chapter 3 do allow a lot of the commercial, allow a lot of the residential uses currently. But that's a mapping question that we'll take on next year.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, back to easements. So in this document, there's a tree preservation easement. In the old UDO, it has also a tree conservation easement where no trees can be removed. Why is that not present here? Is that encompassed under conservancy easement or?
Sorry, just a second.
I'm on page 217.
Yeah.
But I'm using the summer draft, so my apologies.
I'm trying to look to see, we call out, yeah, I'm not positive on the answer to that question. Yes, so in the current code, there are two separate I'll have to get an answer for you on that. I don't know that it was intentionally removed.
Okay. Appreciate hearing back from you on that. On the commercial employment subdivision, which mysteriously is abbreviated CI, there's no open space requirement. Why is that? Is that going to be assured through zoning district requirements, or is that ensured some other way that there's open space in the subdivision?
So for a commercial subdivision, there's no required, I'm not sure what's currently looked at. Again, generally, some of the things that we were looking at doing is to allow for more urbanization and trying to balance the kind of growth and sprawl. So generally, the open space requirements and those sorts of things are directed towards your mixed use and residential and not your commercial. But we can look at the open space requirements for the commercial. There are environmental standards and other things that would need to be set aside through karst features and other land development standards. So again, with the subdivision requirement, I'll have to take a closer look at the open space requirements or standards.
Yeah, so that's a carryover from our existing commercial subdivision, and that no open space is required with that type of subdivision. And I think it's like what Scott is saying, that in the other types of subdivision, the open space are typically for like a common open space, and that that is generally thought to be geared toward residential in the other two types, I think is why it was left out initially.
Okay. I'm curious about cul-de-sacs too in this subdivision, but I don't have time, so.
Okay.
Further questions? Second round. I had a question about, you have lighting, street lighting, lighting fixture styles, and various requirements, but anything pertaining to that I'm missing about efficiency? In other words, LEDs are preferred.
I'll have to get back with you on that. A lot of the lighting requirements, typically my understanding is with the Board of Public Works, we work with Duke. They're the ones that provide the street lights, and we are limited to what their options are on the type of fixtures and types of lighting. And again, the city pays for the electricity and meters for those. So I generally believe the direction is they're heading that way, but I don't have a specific answer to that question. That's more of a Public Works question.
Okay, and I'd like to remind council members that questions are encouraged, written questions to staff are encouraged. Any other second round questions? Councilmember Piedmont Smith, cul-de-sacs.
So I do have time to ask about cul-de-sacs. So in the commercial subdivision, cul-de-sacs are allowed. Why would that be necessary? I mean, we always talk about connectivity being so important, so I'm wondering why that was left in.
Sure, I think it's a fair question. I think it's a carryover. There wasn't a lot of change proposed with the existing types of subdivisions that we have. The main change for this chapter was the addition of the infill subdivision, which, in the last 5 or maybe 8 years is the majority of what we do, small, 1 or 2 lots. We haven't done very many of the larger suburban, traditional, or the conservation or the business subdivisions. So I believe that was just brought over.
So
It
you might be
can be
amenable
useful,
to.
it can be useful, even though it seems counterintuitive, in places where conservation is needed, where there are environmentally sensitive areas, to be able to have development next to that where you wouldn't want a street going through that area. I think we see that. We've seen that sometimes on the fringes of town where we have maybe more environmentally sensitive areas, like maybe in the PIC area, the Public Improvement Corporation subdivision we saw recently. But yes, it's a carryover. So we could we can discuss with the consultant, are there reasons to leave it in, or does it make sense to take it out?
Thank you.
We have 8 minutes remaining for second round questions, if anyone has any others. Okay, seeing none, we'll go to the public. If the public would like to comment, this is on Chapter 5 of the UDO subdivision standards. Remember to state your name and sign in.
I'm Michelle Henderson. I signed in already, so I assume I don't sign in again?
Is that correct? Does the clerk, is it? Just the name, right? You're right, thank you.
I live in the Near West Side. The lots are deep. And I moved there from the suburbs. We built a house. And I'm a gardener, and the soil in the suburbs was terrible. I never really knew good soil till I moved into our house on the Near West Side, because that topsoil had never been removed. And so I could not believe how easy it was to grow things. That's a real resource. I love what I'm hearing about urban farming, about us being able to grow our own food, and I think that's something to consider. The suburbs, the newer suburbs, they don't have the same kind of land, they don't have the same diversity of plants. And so I would ask again that you consider preserving the core neighborhoods that are historic, that have a lot of benefits that you don't see in some of the other suburbs. I'd also ask for some consideration about the fact that the suburbs have larger houses, larger lots, and covenants that protect them. So whatever wonderful ideas that we have for more density, we're not going to see it in those suburbs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sandy Clothier again from Near West Side. I just wanted to mention that when we were going through the UDO process, one of the things that I was struck by is that there seemed to be no change in suburban lots or the way that they were constructed. And I asked a question of the people who were here talking about that, Clarion, and they said, well, they didn't see any need to change it. It seems to me that if gridded, dense areas are what we want them everywhere and not just in the inner city. And one of the real failures, it seems to me, of this entire plan is that it doesn't look at the city as a whole and see that we can develop areas all around our city and densify them and have areas where there is employment and there is access to grocery stores, and then make those more dense. It shouldn't all fall onto the core neighborhoods. It should be in the areas all around the city. And keeping a suburban plan that kind of wanders around forever and doesn't kind of grid the streets and make it easy for walkability just misses the point. And I just think it's a lack of imagination. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter Dorfman from the very overrepresented Near West Side. I applaud the council's interest in accommodating the big picture in these discussions. So I just wanted to call attention to one big picture fact of life. The future of brick and mortar retail everywhere, not just in Bloomington, is really bleak. And the future of housing looks pretty rosy from an investment perspective. So I would hope that you would think in terms of an amendment that builds into the UDO an explicit recognition that all those retail areas should be up for grabs, either by definition in the UDO review process or during the mapping process. We have vast areas of retail that look like the trends are that they're headed for the abyss. And we should be explicitly targeting those areas for conversion to dense or mixed density housing. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is David Keppel, and I live in Sherwood Hills 2 Condominium Association off Walnut Street Pike. And I would like to comment on sustainability in townhouse situations like mine. One of our residents is particularly environmentally conscious and is now planning to install solar on his roof, which I commend. We have, with our attorney, constructed a lease agreement because, of course, this is complex in terms of ownership since the HOA owns the roof and the resident it benefits from the solar electricity and is, in this case, paying for it. But my comment is a more general one, and that is I would hope that we would build in strong incentives for both in new subdivisions for sustainability and for upgrades in sustainability. Another area is we have areas between our buildings where a noisy lawnmower comes through. In the light of urban agriculture, I keep thinking of that as being a shared garden. I don't know how this could all apply in code, but I would encourage us to be as resourceful as possible, both in supporting initiatives that arise and in creating incentives for them within subdivisions. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Are there others? Okay, we're back to council for another round of questions. Anyone interested? Okay, Councilmember Volin.
I wanted to ask about the role that historic preservation plays in processes for preventing, I know that there's already sort of there's been a lot of debate about plexes in neighborhoods. Wouldn't a plex be limited in its ability to be built based on historic preservation? Wouldn't a building have to go through the process for historic preservation before it could just be, there are some protections there, aren't there?
Sorry, I thought he said he was, sorry, yes.
I don't know how to frame the question.
If it's being built in a local historic district, then yes, they all have separate guidelines with different levels of stringency, but yes, the Historic Preservation Commission would weigh in on that.
So, for example, the Near West Side, which is overrepresented tonight, they're not yet a historic district, is that correct? But if
I believe
they're
under interim protection.
They're on the agenda, yeah, they're about to come
Yeah,
to
so
the
they're
council.
under interim protection, correct, right now.
Yeah, but aren't there substantial protections to such a neighborhood that's protected by a historic preservation that doesn't apply to another neighborhood?
The historic preservation, being locally designated, does add an extra layer of protection, yes.
And by protection, you mean delay or prevention?
An extra layer of review for, in this case, because of historic preservation, of design of the building.
Earlier, you said that there were 22 of 25, what do you call it?
Conditional use
Conditional
permits.
uses were approved, but there were many more that didn't even reach that stage.
Yes, many, many more.
Okay.
Yes. So the one that's most pertinent is the accessory dwelling units. And when we gave our presentation last year at the end of 2018, our first yearly required review for you all, which we'll be doing here in the next month or so again, that was something that we highlighted, and that's when we highlighted that we largely are telling people that they weren't going to be likely to receive that approval because they weren't able to meet minimum lot size. That was the main sticking point for conditional uses. So yes, for all conditional uses, we try to counsel people and, so that they don't spend money and come to the Board of Zoning Appeals if it's unlikely that they could be approved.
Last question is there any kind of historicness in minimum lot sizes? If we're going to reduce minimum lot sizes, is there anything in a historic district description that precludes a lot size going smaller?
Not that I know of. They all have different regulations, but no, not related to minimum lot size.
Thank you.
Further questions? I'll ask one. So Ms. Clothier mentioned.
I'm just not sure when is the appropriate time for me to answer a question that was asked earlier that I have the answer to now. So just let me know when that's.
Which question was it, Ms. Porter?
Of how we know that a permanently affordable unit will remain affordable if the owners change, the ownership changes. And there's a commitment that's recorded at the courthouse, so it would come up in a title search.
Okay. All right, thanks for that information. I had a question.
About Ms. Clothier's?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the question was, how is this different than the previous UDO? I mean, I
Sure.
see in traditional subdivision, ensures creation of grid-like street, alley system,
Yes, so
et
I actually
cetera. So-
misspoke earlier. The things have carried over, but suburban subdivision is not one of them. So the suburban subdivision with the windy roads and the larger lots, that is an option right now, is actually not being brought forward. So traditional subdivision, conservation subdivision, the business subdivision, and then our new infill subdivision are the only options.
I see. So we are now going to have the traditional grid pattern.
Yes, so if you are
restored.
developing out in a larger tract into a subdivision, you'll have to follow that.
Yeah. And then I wanted to follow up on Mr. Dorfman's question about repurposing, I suppose, especially large big box retail that are clearly struggling at this point. Is that anticipated at all in this document?
I was asking, so I'm not sure. We'll have to check. It was something that's been discussed. I was thinking more on a smaller scale, like at Hillside and Henderson, how those were supposed to be built to be able to be one or the other. It was something we discussed, and I'm not sure that it is actually included in this draft, but we can verify that.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, we're going to second round. Councilmember Volin.
I wanted to ask briefly about, I don't know if it's in the infill subdivision or not, but to go along with what Ms. Clothier said about, we need to densify the whole city, that doesn't just include sort of making residential subdivisions denser. It also means creating more integration between residential and non-residential. Is there anything in the infill subdivision that talks about mixed use, commercial in the midst of residential, the notion of the corner pub or the corner store, that would be, the perfect example of this is the building on East 2nd Street, the former IGA, former Blooming Foods, a business that was always in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Are those precluded, encouraged, tolerated, or not contemplated?
So I think that may end up being a mapping question, but the infill subdivision, it can be done in any base zoning district. So it could be done to amend areas like that that are commercial within residential, but the actual uses for those sites would be derived from what the actual zoning category is for those areas. So when this body looks at where you want to draw the new lines, the guidance from the comprehensive plan has those focus areas in town that create those kind of small nodes where we would look to have a mixed-use district in those areas to be able to create that.
But it does contemplate those small nodes. It does not discourage them.
It does allow, yes.
It might not go so far as to say that it encourages them, but maybe it does. Would you say that
Yes.
you're encouraging it? Very good. Thank you.
We're on, yes, Councilmember Sturbaum.
Are those nodes still considered and required in the PUDs where we want to have polycentric development, or is it all residential now? Don't we want commercial in a new PUD so that we have, the old PUDs always had commercial aspect and residential. Are we still going for polycentric development, or have we dropped that in the PUD areas?
We would prefer that PUDs be multi-use.
Yeah,
Does that answer the question? Yeah.
thanks.
Okay, we're still on questions before we go to comment. Seeing no more questions, we will now go to, debate. Comment and debate. Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah, my comment, because I'm on the Historic Commission, is that the commission and the protections are complicated. In the Conservation District, demolition is not allowed. However, additions are allowed. And in fact, in conservation districts, they are not reviewed. So you could make a duplex or a triplex by adding on to a house in conservation districts without review by the Historic Commission. In a regular historic district, there would be review, but we never have turned down additions. We simply review how they fit. So that isn't going to stop duplexing. And then outside of historic districts, 95%, maybe more, of demolition delays are simply passed through. You know, they happen to be on a state survey. They come to us, and many of them are contributing structures, which means by themselves they're not worthy of coming to council. You know, we think, well, this would be nice if it was in a district, but here's this one place or this isolated building. We're not going to recommend to council because council is the ultimate decider of preservation. So the demolition delay is almost no protection. You know, I always think of it as a large net, and we're trying to catch the important structures before they go. But it's rare that we're bringing from a demolition delay aspect to council. We're mainly passing them through, but giving them one last review. That's a comment period.
Is it about Chapter 5? I didn't recognize anything about Chapter 5 in your comment. Are we allowed to comment on anything, Mr. Chair? Mr.
I'm
Chair,
commenting on
I'm asking the chair.
Councilmember Volan's question,
I guess
was not disallowed. So I'm commenting on the response to that question, which I didn't think was fully answered, and I thought I could help.
Okay. It seems appropriate since the subject was brought up. Do you have any further comment? It's turning into a debate. So, Councilmember Volan.
We're allowed to have debate.
We are.
This body, you know, we had talked about doing 2 2-minute bites of the apple, and instead it's become 1 4-minute bite. That's why I've been a little huffy about it this evening. I think I appreciate the answers to the restrictions that historic preservation has on the question of plexes. That was interesting and educational. And I don't know that Chapter 5 is the right place to think about it. I was more concerned about the generally positive things that I've heard about the reduction in the minimum lot size. That's good. We want more, you know, smaller development. We want smaller houses are more affordable. We can fit more of them in a given area. More people want to live near, let me cite this section again of the comprehensive plan, policy 5.1.2 establishes affordable housing in locations with close proximity to schools, employment centers, transit, recreational opportunities, and other community resources to increase access. Here's an important policy that I think we should be spending more time on, and the more places where we can get more people in those centralized areas, the better. But I also hear the concern of the core neighborhoods. It's not like I never heard it. And Ms. Clothier's point about how we should be infilling the whole city, I think, was addressed by staff about how infill subdivisions can be retrofitted onto any other type. That's very good news. But I think we need to think a little bit further than that. We, you know, the downtown doesn't have to be the only center of the city of Bloomington. The reason that the downtown is saved now is because back in the early 80s, somebody said, let's save the courthouse. The courthouse was a government building, and it creates an anchor for all other kinds of activity. Saving the courthouse had this domino effect that wound up causing us to save the whole square, and now we have a very successful downtown. We could create the seed of the development of more city centers in other places. I mean, one of the de facto centers of the city is the corner of 3rd and College Mall Road, but it's literally under the jurisdiction of INDOT, and they are very car happy. But the future, in the next 50 years, we could and should see grayfield development out there, development of new property on parking lots, because they're big, unwieldy, unnecessary. We can seed that by building a new government building when we need one. If we need a new police headquarters, maybe we build it on the east side, or we build it somewhere where we can build another town center. If we had the chance in 2003, we built the utilities building, but it doesn't face the street at all. It's got the parking lot in front, it's set back, there's no we had a chance there to build some kind of a town center on the south side. We need to think about the downtown not being our only center, even as we want to protect it and grow it. That would also take pressure on the so-called core neighborhoods. Maybe we can make a core neighborhood out of Councilmember Chopra's neighborhoods in Park Ridge East by creating a new town center out there. Again, that can be seeded, started up with the need to develop some new city building. Or frankly, a county building. It doesn't preclude that. We are the county seat of Monroe County. We could work with the county government to have them think that way about it too. We don't have to all be in one place, and it's getting increasingly expensive to do so. That's my comment. Thank you.
Other comments from council? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say I think it's very unfortunate that we can't stick to the topic at hand, or at least try to relate what we're saying to Chapter 5. Be that as it may, I have a specific point about Chapter 5 that I forgot to ask about, so I'll just say it sort of as a comment. I think my questions kind of speak for what my concerns are. In the section about street design, which is part of the subdivision chapter, there's this thing called eyebrows. And I know it was just carried over from the old one, I know it. But there's some streets in my district that have these so-called eyebrows. And that means like you're driving along the street and then there's a little crescent shape where you can pull off, and then there's like 4 homes on that little eyebrow. They're not directly on the street. God forbid we be directly on the street. They are on this eyebrow. Well, I think that is a very automobile-centric way of building. It's a waste of asphalt. It's something it only belongs in the suburban subdivision, and we've thrown out the suburban subdivision, very rightly so. So that'll be another amendment I'm going to bring, is to get rid of those eyebrows. Thank you.
Further comment on Chapter 5? Okay, seeing none, do we have any other matters, Mr. Sherman, to cover this evening?
Closing out our initial review next Wednesday, and then we'll be considering amendments mid-November. It's time for you to start thinking and clarifying what amendments you might need, so that's my
Councilmember Chopra,
question.
did you have a question?
I do. Our next meeting about the UDO is next Wednesday at 6 or 6:30?
It's at 6 p.m.
6 p.m., okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I thought the public might like to know, too.
And that will cover Chapters 6 and 7. Councilmember Volin?
Yes, Mr. Sherman, could you give us a little bit of guidance on what you want from council members in order to begin thinking about amendments? Do you want us to give you actual text? Do you want to issue us a form? Or should we just send you a few paragraphs or a few lines of text that say what we want to do?
Unless you disagree, we're working off the form we've used in the past, and we'll make that available this week. So, and
if we have ideas before that, should we just send you an email? Or do you just want to do you want us to fill out the form?
I think if you have a clear idea of what you want, send it along. And if you have time, we'd like for you to fill out the form.
I mean, we have time for both, I just don't know, like, if we have ideas before the form is issued. I can send you stuff now.
Share what you know. That
Okay.
way we can get a good idea of what's coming up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I just wanted to thank the public for coming out this evening. It's always impressed by the collective wisdom of Bloomington. Is there a motion to recess?
So moved.
All in favor of recessing?
Aye.
Any opposed? We're recessed until October 30th at 6 p.m.